Hello to everyone. I'm very excited to finally have my good friend and colleague, Dr. John Taranjo, join us on the Social Work Podcast. Dr. John Taranjo is born and raised in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, is an accomplished teacher, lecturer, counselor, mentor, author, entrepreneur, and now a retired clergy person, and has lived and worked in New Mexico for over 30 years. Dr. John Taranjo completed his PhD in Organizational Development at Benedictine University in Lisle, Illinois, currently serves as assistant professor in the Facundo Valdez School of Social Work at New Mexico Highlands University in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He is also the founder and owner of Nueva Vida Counseling and Consulting Services, while at the same time supporting local communities in the expansion of mental health and pastoral counseling services as a master level licensed clinical social worker, licensed K-12 school social worker, and licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor, or LADAC. Additionally, John holds a Master's of Divinity in Missiology from Catholic Theologian Union and an MBA from the University of Phoenix. He enjoys reading, writing, family, friends, good food, hiking, and snowboarding. John, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited about this conversation today.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here with you.
Absolutely. Now, I always like to start podcasts because I'm always interested in knowing about people's path to social work. Now, having been a colleague of yours for some time, I know that you have quite an interesting path to social work. Can you share with our listeners, John, how did the profession of social work find you?
I like the way that you frame that because indeed, social work did choose me. I had no intention of ever becoming a social worker. It was not on my radar screen, personally or professionally. As you indicated in the introduction, I am a retired clergy person, and as a very young man in my mid-teen years, I went away to Catholic seminary and ultimately was ordained a Catholic priest in, let's see, what year was that? 1986, so some years ago. And I was asked as a young clergy person to move from the Midwest to New Mexico. Why? Because primarily I was bilingual and there was need of a bilingual or some bilingual clergy in New Mexico. And interestingly enough, I was fluent and am fluent in Spanish after having failed French in high school. I think I got a D in French, and so I always like to say and share the story of failure, that sometimes failure in life opened doors of opportunity. And so in college, I studied Spanish and did very well, and doing so changed the course of my life. And so here I am, 30 years later, 30 plus years later in New Mexico, and loving it all.
Absolutely. Wow. I think that's a good lesson. I know that we've had several conversations about that, and a good conversation starter with our students who sometimes find social work as well at different points in in their lives. So you were a Catholic priest, you are a Catholic priest, and you were working in New Mexico. How did you then find social work, or how did social work find you at that point?
Yes, the next part of the story, page two, if you will. I started out in Albuquerque as an assistant pastor on the West Mesa, and I had an opportunity to become a pastor in rural New Mexico. And I knew that the personnel board of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe was having difficulty finding a pastor in Mora County, north of Santa Fe. And it was the main church, Santa Gertrudis or St. Gertrude the Great, and 15 missions. So pretty much the whole county of Mora. And I offered to move to Mora, and to begin my pastoral work there. And a lot of my colleagues at the time told me that I would not survive rural New Mexico, the harshness of it all. And because I'm not a native son, I would not be welcomed or accepted. And so I began my sojourn there as pastor in the Mora Valley and in the little community of Mora and the surrounding communities, with a bit of fear and trepidation. And here I am 30 years later. And early on in my tenure, I was approached by a family who had a son who had been abused by a clergy member. And I realized that there was some need for counseling, and there weren't any counseling resources in the area. And so that led me to reflect upon the need to gain some counseling skills. And so I found New Mexico Highlands University and the School of Social Work, and so began that line of study. And it really enhanced my work as a clergy person. And ultimately, I decided to do social work, counseling in particular, full time.
Wow. And so with that, you became a clinical social worker after obtaining your master's in social work. And later you also became a substance use and misuse counselor, a LADAT. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of the story?
Yes, that came several years later, and what I learned, Ben, is that, or what I discovered, is that not only were there mental health challenges and needs, but there were also challenges with addictive patterns and behaviors with alcohol and various substances that were being used. And I began to recognize that people in rural New Mexico were deeply grounded in spirituality, if you will. Religion, yes, but spirituality more so. And that was coupled with mental health challenges and also the substance use in a cultural context. And so people were seeking me out to have conversations about how to move forward, how to find healing, how to create a life worth living, and how to get there. And so I decided that there was a need for me to do some study in substance use and misuse. And so I found an online program a handful of years ago at Santa Fe Community College and completed that and took the national licensure exam and became licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor here in New Mexico. And I find that the marriage, if you will, of clinical social work and of substance use work on that bedrock of spirituality, culture, and the lifestyle and the relational lifestyle here in northern New Mexico really serves the community well and prepares me well to be a provider.
Absolutely. So along that train of thought, now I know that we are very happy that you are on our teaching faculty. But in addition to teaching and a lot of the consultation work that I know that you do, you maintain a very active private clinical social work practice in this area of rural northern New Mexico. Can you tell us a little bit about your years of service in the Mora Valley and in the surrounding communities?
Yes, as my career unfolded and developed, I began work and consultation with the medical clinic in the Mora Valley, and I was asked to come on as a team leader in the behavioral health side of the program to help reestablish um, uh, behavioral health services in the Mora Valley. And so I worked with a number of young clinicians who were coming on the team at the Mora Valley Clinic, and also helped to build the school-based health center at the Mora Independent Schools. So I got to work with a whole lot of students from preschool through high school. And I found that my life as it was unfolding supported well the desires of the community to grow spiritually, culturally, and also to heal areas of mental health challenges and substance use challenges. The latter realities of which we don't talk much about in rural communities, and I might add also in urban settings as well. Usually, what happens among us stays among us. In our family systems, we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, et cetera, et cetera. And we were beginning to discover a way to give voice to dealing with the challenges of life, but from a strengths perspective, all the good things that were happening, within and among us as a people. And so what I discovered, long story short, is that, I'm a man well prepared with a heart on mission. And it's about relationships, and once relationships are forged and formed, a lot of healing can happen and strength building.
Absolutely. And I love that, the way that you phrase that, a heart on mission. And I think it speaks very well to what students have talked about, being witness to your journey and your teaching. And, you mentioned that idea of self-reliance and how that can be sometimes maybe a hindrance to people seeking out services, seeking out behavioral health support services, but having lived and worked as well all my life in very rural parts of New Mexico, I know that, that also that idea of self-reliance is something that's necessary for people to live and thrive in these rural areas. So I wonder, John, what have you enjoyed the most about being a rural social worker, and what are some of the challenges that you find in the work that you do in the mountains of rural northern New Mexico?
What I've enjoyed most, Ben, is the relational aspect of life in rural New Mexico, and also the work that I've done as a clergy person, as a social worker, and as a drug and alcohol abuse counselor. Being invited into people's lives, and having a very healthy, powerful, and dynamic relational experience, or therapeutic alliance, if you will. I particularly love interacting with people in their homes, around the mesa, the kitchen table, while having a bit of, frijolitos and a tortilla, and a glass of juice, or something of the like. And it's about becoming one with people, as a community member, but also as a professional.
That's, I think, similar. Early on in my own practice experience, I had the opportunity to work in Mora as well, and I know that that idea of acceptance and being a part of the community sometimes is a bit daunting to someone who's not from that community. And I heard a lot of the same things of, oh well, you're not originally from Mora, so you're not necessarily going to be accepted there. But once you're able to join and have that feeling of we're on a similar mission, and we're on the same team, and that it's such a beautiful experience to be able to get to know people and be accepted into people's lives in that way.
It's about meeting people where they are on life's journey at many, many different levels. And it's about supporting them in articulating their strengths and their needs and desires for growth and change, and for embracing a spirit of thriving, if you will. You had also asked about some of the challenges of the rural social work. Many blessings indeed, that personal interactive style. Some of the challenges, however, would be lack of resources. And one of the things I always tell students whom I have the privilege of mentoring and teaching and interacting with, is that as social workers, especially in rural communities, we may be clinical providers, but we are never above or beyond case management. And that before we can meet the mental health needs and challenges of those whom we are called to serve and where we live in rural New Mexico. We need to make sure that basic needs are being met. And so, where are the food boxes being provided? Is there help for wood or propane, etc.? And to be able to ferret out those kinds of resources and connect them. And then, in terms of ethics, and I know we're going to talk about this more in detail, the challenges of being a member of a rural community and a professional person providing services. What about dual relationships? That can get very, very challenging. And the other piece that's challenging is that, I think the only senior clinical provider currently in the Morta Valley, and there are a number of younger, clinicians, and that's good. And I think one of the challenges that I see is I may have an individual come to me, but then what happens when a partner or a spouse also wants to see me, and then a family system? Maintaining those lines of confidentiality, quite honestly, are very challenging. Because sometimes, we do our best to maintain confidentiality, and sometimes those lines can get blurred or challenged.
Hmm. Absolutely. Just go into local grocery stores. I know that everyone, because when you live in a very rural area, everyone congregates around those areas, and so it is very difficult to maintain that idea of confidentiality. That is something that I know that I've had to wrestle with at different points in my career as well. Now, I do want to circle back to this idea of ethical considerations here in a second. But first, one thing that I learned from you, John, and I know that our students have learned from you, is that really effective rural social work requires a bit of adapting and modifying of traditional social work practice models, not developing entirely new forms of practice. So, what does a rural social work model look like for you?
I think in terms of a rural social work model, I really like to build upon Michael Daly's down home model of rural social work. He has a wonderful textbook. I think the latest version is the second edition is 2021. Rural social work in the 21st century, I believe, is the title. Of the book, and he underscores that rural practice requires a multifaceted model. There are a number of elements or aspects to it, and that even though rural communities are often portrayed as having lack of resources and struggling and always in need, that it's important to recognize what the strengths are and where the strengths are in rural community. And so I think, in the strengths perspective is something that I learned about when I was a social work student here at New Mexico Highlands University back in the late 90s. And also, person and environment. What's the environment like? What's the flavor and the tenor of that? It's very important to meet people where they are. And so I think in some ways, as clinical social workers, we're practitioners in a generalist kind of way or framework, which brings in, problem solvings, persons and environment, and what systems or organizations are present within the community, and how can we interface with them, connect with them in terms of providing support, hope, and encouragement for people. So it's about strengths, it's about assets, it's about opportunities, and it's about building upon that rural framework, family, community, long-standing interpersonal relationships, which is really important, which is different than urban social work. Yes, there's the one-on-one or the interpersonal in larger cities and communities. Yet at the same time, there's also a much more impersonal nature to social work as you deal with systems and organizations. So, for example, in a rural community, we know everybody and everybody knows us. It's about the fishbowl. And how do we live in that, fishbowl, um, as community members, but also as professional um, providers?
Absolutely. I think that it's important that you bring that up because it's true that a lot of the rural social work and service literature is focused on that what it is that rural communities lack. And I think it's important also to look at the flip side of that, when, like you said, when applying the strengths perspective of social work, but looking at building upon a lot of the strengths of those rural communities. What are some of those strengths, John, that you have experienced in rural social work?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I or one of the realities that I continue to learn about is the presence of the local healers. The curanderas, for example, and the curanderos. And I always tell the story that, for many years, I've been a member 30 years and plus in the Mora Valley. And whenever word gets out that I'm not feeling well, people will make inquiry as to what is going on. And then shortly thereafter, somebody shows up with a jar of a homemade remedy, from the natural plants, the yerbas, and it doesn't always taste good, but I'm told to drink 3 glasses a day and I get better. So it's about connecting clients with the local healers, or encouraging them um, to seek out the local healers, and also on occasion I have the privilege of interacting with someone from one of the area or nearby pueblos, and they often will want to connect with the longstanding native traditional kinds of practices. The medicine men, for example, are going to the kiva, for those sacred kinds of encounters. I always encounter that or encourage that and look for ways to include that in, the Western style of treatment, that many of us are trained in as well. The DSM-5 TR, perspectives. That there's much more, and so I'm always learning about that. And recently, I went to a community gathering, and there was a curandera present who was offering limpiezas, cleansings, for those of us going into the meeting. And so to participate in that as well is really a powerful witness and healing experience for me personally and professionally.
Absolutely. And what a great example of what this social work perspective, the biopsychosocio spiritual perspective of looking at the whole person, and how do we support and help to heal the different aspects of a person. And we have a lot to learn. We do understand a lot of that and bring that Western idea of behavioral health and of physical health, but then what can we also learn from the natural healers that have been in these communities for many, many centuries?
At times I have students say, and you may have as well, I don't know about this biopsychosocial spiritual assessment, stuff. I'm not spiritual, or I don't practice religion or spirituality. And my response to them is, well, okay, I'm not, and we're not going to judge you for the choices that you make in life. However, how do you meet a client there in that spiritual or religious realm, because it's important to them? Are you able to do that? And if not, what ethical challenges or decisions might come up that you need to make in terms of, if this is really important to a client, but not so much to you as the provider, well, then maybe there might be a need to refer or to bring someone in who can support them in these areas.
Absolutely, definitely. And just something I've picked up along the way in the way of a pro tip is add a little bit of local honey in, and it helps some of those remedios, some of those herbal tinctures taste just a little bit better, make them a little
Yes,
bit more palatable.
absolutely. Uh-huh.
Now, John, circling back a little bit, I know that for many rural social workers, ethical considerations are always at the forefront of their minds. You touched on a couple of them a few minutes ago, but I wonder if you could share with our listeners what ethical considerations you feel are most important to consider for social workers who are practicing in rural settings. And then also, while maintaining confidentiality, of course, I wonder if you might be willing to share a couple examples of situations that you've faced that have caused you to reflect a little bit more on the code of ethics in your practice.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite areas of discussion uh, and teaching. As I indicated earlier, we social workers in rural communities, we live in a fishbowl, and I think our lives are highly scrutinized. We are watched very carefully, and I believe that, and some might disagree with me, but I believe because of the fishbowl reality, as a context for rural social work ethical reflection and practice, that we are called to a higher standard of 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 living and being, among the people in the communities in which we live. So, and that's a challenge. So some of the more prominent ethical considerations or challenges in rural social work that we read about in the literature, but also that I've experienced. Number one is the difficulty in maintaining confidentiality, and I have a great story about this. I moved my private practice from Las Vegas, New Mexico, to the Morta Valley a couple years ago. And it's right. My office, the office I rent, is right off the highway. And one day, a client called prior to coming to session and said, "Do you have a parking area in the back of the office?" And I said, "Well, not really, but there's an a little open, field or backyard that you could drive in. Why are you asking?" "Well, I don't want," and the client said, "I don't want people to see my truck in front of your office. I don't want them to know that I'm coming to counseling." And so I always tell people now, if you don't want to park in front, you can park in back, and the back door is always open. Just feel free, to come in. So confidentiality is really, really important. And so, what about seeing clients out in public? I see them all the time, and they see me. What we talk about is, how are we going to interact with each other when we see each other in public? And basically, or more often than not, what we decide is that the client or the family, the client system, can greet me and I'll greet them in return, but I'm not going to greet them first. A challenge for me is when I decide to go out for a meal to one of the handful of local restaurants. Inevitably, um, there's a client or a family that I'm working with, having lunch or early evening dinner, and they will often invite me to join them. Do we join them or not? That's really gray matter. It's a gray area. And based on reality, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just am so exhausted I want to eat by myself. However, if I don't join them, they may take offense. And so I've got to be reading the dynamic of the interaction and base my decision on that. So the dual and multiple relationships, going to church, going to the grocery store, going to the mechanic, inevitably I'm going to be interacting with someone that I've seen or am seeing, or I may be seeing one of their extended family members or coworkers, for example. The other, I think, challenges, and then I'll back off here, is as as social workers and as providers in the community, it's really important to have supervision. Even someone like me who's been at it for many, many years, I am not above or beyond supervision. And in rural communities, it's very challenging to get good supervision. However, in this age of telehealth, post COVID 19, telehealth is much more available and acceptable. And so, um, it's great to connect with colleagues over Zoom, for example, or Doxy.me or other, secure platforms to be able to talk about a case and to get some good supervision.
I think that that's important to highlight because that is something that we've heard from many of our students and alumni for many years as well, is it's very difficult to find good quality supervision in rural settings. And I think that this new reality that you speak of having access to people through online mediums is definitely it's helped to expand services to our clients, of course, but also expand the availability of supervision. And so I think that that's a really important thing to point out. You mentioned the having the conversation with clients that I'm not going to acknowledge you until you acknowledge me. I think that that's something we've all learned over the years, many of us social workers, because you're right. We see, and it inevitably, even you show up to a neighbor's barbecue and there is clients there. And so allowing them to make that first contact and then keeping it just really kind of really brief. I remember having a conversation very early on with my wife of, when we're in public, if someone, is coming up to me, I'm not always going to introduce you and know that I'm not being rude, but it's just part of the work that I'm involved in and the work that I'm doing. And so it's important, I think, to have those conversations with our own family and friend circles as well.
Absolutely. Recently, I was at Walmart in Las Vegas, and I'm dealing with two little brothers, and grade school, early on in grade school. And anyway, they saw me at the other end of the food aisle, in one of the food aisles in Walmart, and they were just so excited to see me, and so they left, the parents, and they came running down the aisle, and it's like, Mr. John, Mr. John, Mr. John, and, a big hug and whatnot. And then there was another family, and after the two boys, went back to their parents after the short interaction, another family said, well, how do you know those two?
Hmm.
And there you go, that challenge again. Oh, it's just, we live in Mora, we all know each other, kind of a
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. I remember when my daughter was really young, one time, and it was, I think it may have also been at Walmart where I had a similar experience where I was working clinically with kiddos and got you know, the little one running up to give a hug and hi and so excited to see you. And my daughter already knew, but after the kid left, she said, oh, really loudly, oh, Dad, is that one of your kids? And and I remember getting a side look from somebody that was walking by wondering, well, how many kids I must have. But it's funny, those stories that we have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the other challenges, which also presents an opportunity for us as social workers, is that a lot of our work tends to be, individual or small group. And this was a lesson that I learned in a profound way doing school-based health center. As you may know, in many rural communities, or in many communities, urban as well, we have a lot of issues around drug use and misuse, and alcohol use and misuse. And so in high school, for example, a lot of high schoolers struggle with substance use or misuse, and a lot of them learn about this within their family systems, to be quite honest. And my experience was doing school-based health center, that many, if not, well, the majority of these students found um, ways of dealing with issues rather than addictive patterns. And so, they would become, as we say, clean and sober. And part of their moving forward and discharge and celebration was to honor their growth and development. But many of them expressed fear and concern to me. John, I'm going back into a family system, or to my family, and there's all this stuff on the kitchen table, that's really, really hard. And I'm afraid about slipping or relapsing, into old patterns. And so I think one of the challenges for us as social workers is, how do we continually encourage or build or open doors, and meet the opportunity for family systems work. I think that is so important, and I think that's been an area that's been lacking in our training, in our education, and in our formation. And so I just bring that up as an opportunity in the midst of challenges.
Absolutely. I think that's an important consideration for us, is how do we continue to build those supportive structures for the family systems and extended family systems, as you and I well know, that in our part of the country, there many times there are many generations that are living communally. And so how do we build those support systems for the entire system?
How do we build upon the strength of those generational support systems, and also get at the generational traumas and abuses that are present, not to mention the historical traumas and abuses that are societally based.
Hmm. Absolutely. Definitely. Now, anyone who is from our part of the country knows that speaking about trauma, knows that we experienced a pretty traumatic event just this last year around this time. But we may have listeners who are from other parts of the country who don't know about it. But in the spring and summer of 2022, the people in northern New Mexico, our friends, our neighbors, your neighbors, experienced the most destructive wildfire in the history of the state. And so that fire, the Calf Canyon and Hermit's Peak fire, had a burn area that encompassed about 534 square miles in the counties that we live and work in San Miguel and Mora and Taos counties. What was the experience like for you, first as a member of the community who also had to experience evacuation, and then as a social work provider? What were some of those experiences for you, and did you encounter any ethical challenges living and working through that experience as well?
Well, first of all, as a community member, like my fellow community members, traumatic, um, very unsettling, very emotional. Having officials like the state police or the county police drive up and say, it's time to evacuate. The winds are coming in your direction. Your community, your home is in danger. And so I evacuated with my neighbors, and was evacuated for a little over 6 weeks. I felt very grateful, however, because just prior to the fires, I had purchased an older RV that I was kind of renovating and remodeling. And so I, along with my neighbors who also have an RV, we took the only road out, which led us to Taos, about 45 minutes away. And we were in the parking lot of the Tractor Supply Store, which opened, that big parking lot to anyone who needed to set up a camper. And a person, a business owner, happened to be looking for a couple of families to welcome to his place of business, where he had two RV hookups. And so I and my neighbors went with this gentleman, and just extremely generous, even provided me a vehicle to use for the 6 weeks while I was there. And long story short, we've all become friends in the process. I was also teaching at the same time. We were online, as you recall, Ben, and so I was literally teaching class on Zoom, hooked up to the internet on my cell phone. teaching my Highlands classes from the kitchen, the little kitchen table in my camper. Um, Amazing. And then a number of community members were also camping in various parking lots throughout, Taos. They were in area hotels and a number at a local shelter. And so I was standing in lines registering for, food vouchers and, getting assistance and meeting FEMA representatives. And then I would go to the shelters, to take meals that were being prepared, and just sitting and being with my community members and sharing, the trauma and the emotion of our being displaced and having to be evacuated. So I was community member, and yet people were wanting to say, "Can we go off and find a private place to talk?" Because all the other issues were still there, and realities, and the fears, and the anger, and so that kind of blurred ethical boundaries for me a little bit. But ultimately, I decided it didn't matter because I was going to have the conversations that were needed, and I needed to be a community member and process appropriately my own emotions about what was going on, yet at the same time being able to bracket my emotions and to be present to people who needed more in-depth clinical services, if you will. For example, needing psychotropic medications that they had forgotten at home. How do we reconnect, those kinds of services, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I know that that was a very difficult time for you personally, but also for so many of our communities in the surrounding areas. And we spoke a little bit earlier, several minutes ago, about strengths of rural communities. And I think that that was something that in that most difficult time for many people, that was something that we all were able to witness as well. The strengths of these rural communities and that sense of ownership, I think, that everyone felt in the well-being and success of their neighbors. And I know there were many, many times that my wife and children and I went to volunteer at the evacuation center, where there was just so much volunteers that they had to turn people away, but people were wanting to help, and people were opening up their lands and pastures for people to camp and to evacuate with their livestock. And a good friend of mine, was filling up trailers with dog food and chicken feed and pig feed and everything that they could do to try and help people during those times. So those strengths, yeah, those strengths of rural communities, I think that something that maybe is overlooked a little bit, but is something that we found as a resource to help support people during those difficult times.
And it was interesting, you mentioned animals, for example, at the shelter in Taos. There was space for animals of all sizes, and kennels for dogs and cats, and people whose animals were still at home. Other community members would find out and bring them, to the safe place, and just to see people with their pets. And I had my two dogs with me as well. And to be able to get dog food from the shelter was just a wonderful little gift. And I also, would go to the local grocery stores every once in a while to pick up a few items. And on a couple of occasions, people, heard that I was, one of the evacuees and paid for my food bill. It was very, very humbling. But the strength of people coming together, and we are still coming together and supporting each other. It's now okay to go see John at his office in the Mota Valley, to talk. There are less people needing to park in back than in front, and so that's really a positive. Reality. And especially there were a couple of recent fires in early May that re-traumatized, and some of the people who evacuated last year had to evacuate again, and so re-traumatized, so layers of trauma. And so we're looking at all of that, and I think one of the things that I'm struggling with and challenged with is, how do you meet the need in an area, in a rural community, where there aren't enough providers?
And so With that, I wonder, is there a story or two maybe that you'd be willing to share about this idea of loss, recovery, and healing from your own practice experience?
There are a couple of families, there are stories that kind of jump out and that are real significant to me. One is of a family that I've known for over 30 years, and another is of a family that I've come to know in light of loss from the Calf Canyon Hermit's Peak fire. So I'd like just to take a few minutes to tell the story about the family that I've known for many, many years. And this family has a grandparent over 100 years old and still doing quite well health wise, and a mom who's well into her 70s, and one who lost her husband. He passed away several months before evacuation in the fires. And then a couple of adult children and a number of grandchildren of all ages, and I think maybe even some great grandchildren. Long story short, and I have permission to tell these stories, by the way. Long story short, you know, this family was evacuated twice, and the second time they were evacuated, they were not able to take anything. The police came and said, "You must leave immediately." And, this 70-something-year-old mom was asking the people in her life, as they were in a motel because of the aged family member, um, um, you know, what's the status of our home? And she was told that it was okay. And ultimately, she discovered, scrolling through social media, that her home and land had burned 100%. And so you can imagine that shock and that anger, within a family, a generational family, about, you didn't tell me the truth, kind of a thing. Anyway, long story short, until June 1st, just a few days ago, this family has been housed by our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, in a hotel in Albuquerque. And, the challenges, and I've been supporting this family via telehealth, dealing with all of the challenges around navigating FEMA and insurance companies and not coming to the resolution needed in a timely manner to get on with rebuilding life, and all that frustration. And so as of June 1st, they finally were able to move into an appropriate rental in Albuquerque as they continue to navigate all the legal quagmire and whatnot. So at least they have a place now. And, mom said to me not long ago, "I think I've lost my faith. Why would God allow this to happen to me and us? And why did God even take my husband from me before all this happened? Maybe I should go with him. I don't know how much longer I can do this." So, the angst, the tiredness, and the frustration. And ultimately, she says, "Thank God we have someone like you, John, that's willing to listen and support and guide, in addition to all the legal people in their lives." So this woman is a woman of faith, and I believe ultimately, even though she questions her faith, it is the bedrock of spirituality and practice that allows her to keep moving. And I think that's the connection that we have in the midst of the clinical work that we're doing with chronic PTSD or trauma. So that's one family, and their plan is they want to come back to their land, generational land. They want to rebuild, and it's just not happening for them or for many in a timely manner. So a lot of emotional realities. The other is of a family that I've come to know since the fires. Generational land and several families living, generational families living on the land. Grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, and two young grandchildren. Well, mom and dad and the grandchildren lost their home, but grandma and grandpa still have their little adobe home. So they're all living together. Very grateful, yet recognizing after a year plus since the losses that living in a very small space when they're not accustomed to it has been very challenging in many ways. And so they've come to me to do some generational family work and to find new ways of communicating and being together in the midst of the challenges and navigating again the challenges of dealing with FEMA and insurance companies and rebuilding. There's some hope on the future for another home, but not quite there yet. But hope is that it will happen soon. And it's the power of connection and community that allows them, I believe, to allows us to continue to move on, to find new ways of being, problem solving, communicating, and building upon strength, faith, and culture. And not long ago, the whole family, the generational family, came to see me. It was one of Grandma's dreams, and they came to my office. We had a wonderful Saturday morning conversation. Looking at the hope for the future in the midst of the loss and devastation. As we ate homemade natillas, which is a great local dessert, kind of a pudding type dessert, but we shared that food. And so, there are certain gifts that you can receive from people, but there are other gifts that you can't, ethically speaking. So, we have a lot of very creative and artistic people in the area, and I've been offered works of art that are worth, hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. You got to say no to that, even though I must say I was tempted to say, oh my God, that's beautiful. I got the place for it in my living room at home, but, not able to do that. But small gifts of food. I always tell students that I'm not going to turn down a dozen of homemade tortillas, you know, those kinds of things. So there are gifts that can be acceptable, but then there are gifts that cannot be accepted.
Yeah, those ethical decisions are really important for people to make, and I think that that's a good way of looking at that. Now, John, do you have any social work observations, reflections, or maybe lessons learned from your many years of living and serving in the Mora Valley that you'd be willing to share with our listeners?
What I'm learning, and the national or the code of ethics from NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, in 2021. Added two very important amendments. One was for professional care. I also would say, as part of that is personal care, and then also cultural humility, cultural competence. So the two lessons that I would say that I continue to learn is I'm tired. I don't think I'm burned out, but I think that I'm challenged with dealing with secondary trauma, of clients and carrying that. I need to reflect upon and work with my own clinical social worker on better boundaries and how to process the heavy trauma that I seem to be carrying with those that I have the privilege of serving. So I got to get better at self-care. So I think that's really important. One of the things that I note and recognize, at least in the rural Southwest here, Southwestern United States, there aren't many clinical social workers or social workers with longevity. Many start out with great energy, con mucho gusto, and then we tire, we burn out, and we move on. And I want to be part of a movement where I can model for others healthy living and being personally and professionally as a social worker, because we need, elders, and I think I'm becoming one of those now at my age, to be able to role model for those of us younger in the profession. And it's about being empathic. It's about being genuine. It's about meeting people where they are without judgment of any kind. That's really, really important. So those would be a couple of things that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So that idea that you're in the 2021 Code of Ethics, I was very happy to see that self-care was added because I know that this is a conversation that we have often with our students. I'm sure that you have these conversations in the classroom classroom as well, but the importance of that self-reflection and self-awareness and understanding that our needs also change throughout our lives and our experiences, and so continuing that constant process of self-reflection is really important, because self-care can sometimes mean reaching out for additional support as we might need it as well, personally and professionally. So I think that's important to highlight. Now, the second one of the other additions to the 2021 Code of Ethics was this idea of cultural humility. And can I just say, I let out a very vocal cheer when I read that, because I have always had issue with the term cultural competence. It just has always bothered me, because we can never be ever be truly competent in another person's culture and lived experience. But this idea of cultural humility is wording that has been used in the 2021 version of the Code of Ethics. What have you learned about cultural humility working in the mountains of rural northern New Mexico?
It's about interacting with brothers and sisters with whom I live in ways that allow them to teach me how to be a community member, to be with them and um, for them. And a huge part of that is, if I may use the one word, table. Mesa. It's about gathering around the table, literally and figuratively, with people and having open, honest, and humble conversations. I do not know a lot. I know some things, but I want to listen and learn from those that are sitting with me at the table. And I'm going to have my ears perked and I'm going to have my mouth closed more often than not. And I find as I grow older as a person, an individual, and also as a professional and provider, that I say less and I simply am more. I'm much more comfortable with silence and just being with. That makes a huge a difference. And then to teach me, there are still words in Spanish that I don't know and I continue to learn. And folks love teaching. Um, and telling me about their lived experience. And so that's really, really important.
Absolutely. I think that's a great testament of what cultural humility looks like. That ability to understand that, yes, we know some, but we don't know a lot. I like the way that you phrased that, because I think that that approach of allowing the family to guide that process, but also to teach us what their needs are and what their strengths are, and how we can work to help support them in their own recovery and healing process.
Those whom we serve are the experts.
Yes.
People already possess that which they need and desire to support change. And how do we help them to recognize that, to embrace it, and to trust it? And that's all about, culture and the spirit of the people in the particular area where we find ourselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. John, we do have a couple minutes left for the podcast, but I wonder, based upon your years of work, of clinical social work practice in a rural setting, what do you feel are going to be some of the challenges that we're going to continue to see in the future of rural social work?
I think numbers of social workers in rural communities will continue to be a challenge. Um, you and I are part of a school of social work here in Las Vegas at New Mexican Highlands University that has a focus on preparing people of different ages and to encourage them to consider working, and even living in rural communities. And so I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. Social work programs are big in the urban centers, in our state and in other states. How do we build interest and numbers, let's say here on our own campus at New Mexico Highlands University, and support the rural reality. The need for more resources is always going to be there. And so it's not only about the frontline work of being a clinical social worker, that individual or family work, but not only do we do the micro or the meso, that mid-level work, but what about advocating at a macro level? And that's one area where I find an invitation to grow and to learn more about. What about becoming in state issues and legislative efforts, and what dialogue at state levels on different committees? And so that's certainly an area where I'm invited and challenged to grow. I know there was a time in my career early on where I'm a clinical social worker. I focus on the micro and the meso. I'm not interested in the macro, but becoming interested in that is really important because that affects the lives of our rural people. And especially we're seeing that in light of, resources that we're making available for recovery from and healing from the fires. That not only involves state government, but federal government as well. And we're certainly grateful for our state legislators, et cetera, for all of their efforts. And how can we become, part of that? How do we connect with, the spirit of the people? I think is really, really important. So those would be a few things that um, come to mind. What about research? What about providing data? I'm looking at maybe doing some writing around the rural social work experience. Maybe that might encourage younger budding social workers to want to work in rural communities. So those are some thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you for those. I think that you and I both have, because of our lived experience, our personal and professional experience, understand the joys, yes, the challenges, but definitely the joys that rural social work practice can bring to people's professional experience. And so, John, with that, I want to thank you for your time, for sharing this conversation with us today. And I know that you're doing a lot of really great work. You've developed an exceptional course that we offer to our students now on rural social work practice, and so excuse me, so thank you very much for the work that you have done and continue to do for our part of the world and for other rural areas across the country. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you for this opportunity, Ben. I'm happy to do so. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Adios.